Cannabis is now legal in much of the developed world, marketed as a natural alternative to pharmaceuticals and increasingly framed as safer than alcohol. Millions of people use it daily without obvious catastrophe, but your brain doesn't operate on cultural narratives or policy decisions. It operates on neurochemistry. And after 30 consecutive days of THC exposure, something fundamental shifts inside your skull that has nothing to do with whether you feel fine. The changes are measurable. They show up on PET scans as reduced receptor density, on MRI studies as altered prefrontal cortex metabolism, and in sleep labs as disrupted REM architecture. This isn't about whether cannabis is good or bad. It's about what actually happens when you introduce a foreign molecule into a finely tuned regulatory system every day for a month. Your brain already produces its own cannabis. The endocannabinoid system exists in every mammal, acting as what neuroscientists call the dimmer switch of the central nervous system. Two primary molecules, anandamide and 2-AG, are synthesized on demand, fire briefly at specific synapses, and are then rapidly degraded by enzymes. This system modulates everything from memory formation to pain perception to appetite, but it does so with surgical precision, local signals, short duration, immediate cleanup. THC mimics anandamide closely enough to bind to the same receptors, primarily CB1 receptors densely packed in your hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, basal ganglia, amygdala, and cerebellum. But there's a critical difference. Anandamide has a half-life measured in minutes. THC has a half-life measured in days. Anandamide is produced in nanogram quantities at the synapse where it's needed. THC floods your entire brain at concentrations thousands of times higher than any endogenous signal. The endocannabinoid system wasn't designed for this. It evolved to handle brief, localized adjustments. A slight reduction in neurotransmitter release here, a minor modulation of inflammation there. Introducing THC daily is like replacing a thermostat's gentle temperature adjustments with someone holding a blowtorch to the sensor. The system doesn't stop working, but it stops working correctly. CB1 receptors in your hippocampus regulate memory encoding. In your prefrontal cortex, they modulate executive function and impulse control. In your basal ganglia, they influence reward processing and motivation. When THC binds to these receptors, it doesn't activate a pleasure center. It disrupts the regulatory mechanisms that determine which experiences get encoded as memories, which impulses get suppressed, and which activities feel worth pursuing. The first 2 weeks of daily use trigger a cellular defense mechanism that users interpret as tolerance. The biological reality is more specific: receptor downregulation. When CB1 receptors are overstimulated by persistent THC binding, neurons respond by pulling those receptors back inside the cell body, a process called internalization. Some receptors are degraded entirely. Others remain on the cell surface but become desensitized, requiring higher THC concentrations as to produce the same response. A 2012 PET imaging study by Hervinen and colleagues demonstrated this directly. Daily cannabis users showed a 20 to 60% reduction in CB1 receptor availability across nearly all brain regions, with the most dramatic losses in the hippocampus and cortex. This isn't your brain getting used to THC. It's your brain physically removing the machinery through which THC exerts its effects. The receptor reduction is a survival response. The neurons attempt to maintain baseline function despite chronic chemical interference. But those CB1 receptors weren't just sitting there waiting to be hijacked by THC. They were regulating critical processes, modulating dopamine release, filtering sensory input, consolidating memories, regulating appetite and sleep. When a receptor density drops by 40%, those regulatory functions don't just become slightly impaired, they collapse. The hippocampus can't effectively filter which experiences deserve long-term storage, leading to the brain fog users report, but often attribute to stress or fatigue. The prefrontal cortex loses its capacity to suppress impulsive behavior and project future consequences. The basal ganglia's reward processing becomes dysregulated, and here's the trap. The more receptors you lose, the more THC you need to feel anything at all. Users increase their dose to compensate, which accelerates receptor loss, which demands higher doses. This is the neurobiological definition of dependence, even if it doesn't fit the cultural image of addiction. By day 15, something else begins to happen that most users don't anticipate: lipid accumulation. THC is fat-soluble, which means it doesn't dissolve in blood or water. It dissolves in adipose tissue. Every time you use cannabis or CBD, portion of the THC gets sequestered in your fat cells. In occasional users, this stored THC is gradually released and metabolized over a few days. But with daily use, your fat tissue never fully clears. Each new dose adds to the existing reservoir. By day 30, you've reached a pharmacodynamic steady state. Your adipose tissue is saturated with THC, continuously leaking small amounts back into your bloodstream. You're no longer experiencing distinct high and sober phases. You're maintaining a constant low-level intoxication, even hours or days after your last use. The brain is no longer responding to acute THC spikes. It's adapted to chronic background saturation. Meanwhile, imaging studies reveal a pattern called hypofrontality, reduced glucose metabolism and blood flow in the prefrontal cortex. This is the same metabolic signature seen in ADHD, certain personality disorders, and frontotemporal dementia. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for what we consider adult cognitive functions: impulse control, consequence projection, emotional regulation, long-term planning. When its metabolic activity drops, those capacities don't disappear, but they become effortful and inconsistent. Simultaneously, meta-analyses of PT and SPECT studies show something unexpected in the dopamine system. While acute THC use increases dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, the source of the high, chronic use produces the opposite effect, a hypodopaminergic state. After 30 days, the brain's baseline capacity to synthesize dopamine is measurably reduced. This creates a phenomenon called cannabis-induced anhedonia. Activities that once triggered motivation, exercise, socializing, working toward a goal, no longer generate the same neurochemical reward. The user doesn't feel depressed in the clinical sense. They feel flat. Nothing is particularly interesting, but nothing is particularly distressing either. The amotivational syndrome that critics have described for decades and advocates have dismissed as stereotyping is, in fact, visible on brain scans as reduced dopaminergic tone. One of the most common reasons people use cannabis daily is sleep. THC is a potent sedative. It reduces sleep latency, meaning you fall asleep faster. For someone struggling with insomnia, this feels like a solution. But sleep isn't just being unconscious. It's a series of highly structured neurological processes, and THC disrupts the most critical one: REM sleep. REM, rapid eye movement sleep, is when the brain consolidates memories, processes emotions, and clears metabolic waste. It's also when you dream. THC suppresses REM architecture, sometimes reducing it by 50% or more. After 30 days of consistent use, you've accumulated what sleep researchers call REM debt. The consequences aren't immediately obvious because you're still sleeping 8 hours a night, but emotional regulation becomes erratic. Problem-solving abilities decline. Irritability increases. These aren't psychological side effects. They're the neurological outcome of depriving the brain of its nightly maintenance cycle. And then there's the rebound. When users stop after 30 days, REM sleep doesn't just return to normal, it surges. The brain attempts to recover the lost REM time all at once, producing vivid, often disturbing dreams and fragmented sleep. This rebound can last weeks, and it's one of the primary reasons people relapse during early withdrawal. They interpret the intense dreams and poor sleep as evidence they need cannabis, when in reality, it's evidence their brain is trying to repair the damage cannabis caused. Any discussion of cannabis risk using data from before 2000 is analyzing a different drug. Historical cannabis, the strains used in most 20th century research, contain 2 to 4% THC. Modern cannabis flower averages 20 to 30% THC. Concentrates and vapes can reach 90%. This isn't just stronger weed, it's a fundamental shift. In pharmacology, dose determines whether a compound is therapeutic recreational, or toxic. A tenfold increase in potency without corresponding increases in CBD, the compound that buffers THC's neurotoxic effects by modulating CB1 receptor activity, creates a product with unprecedented receptor saturating potential. And unlike pharmaceutical drugs, which undergo years of safety testing before reaching consumers, legal cannabis products enter the market with virtually no longitudinal data on high-potency outcomes. The regulatory gap exists because cannabis was reclassified from illegal drug to legal product without passing through the FDA approval process that would normally require evidence of safety. The 30-day impact isn't uniform. Two factors create a risk gradient: age and genetics. The adolescent brain's endocannabinoid system is most active during the period when the prefrontal cortex is undergoing its final maturation, roughly ages 15 to 25. During this window, the brain is pruning unnecessary neural connections and strengthening critical pathways. This neuroplastic activity is why adolescence is a period of rapid learning, but also vulnerability. THC exposure during this developmental window doesn't just impair function temporarily, it can alter the trajectory of white matter development permanently. MRI studies show that adolescents who use cannabis daily for even short periods display reduced white matter integrity and prefrontal cortex volume compared to non-using peers. A 30-day exposure in a 17-year-old may produce consequences that the same exposure in a 40-year-old would not. The safe for most people narrative ignores that genetic lottery and developmental timing determine outcomes at least as much as dose or frequency. The brain's adaptive timeline is asymmetric. It takes 30 days to downregulate receptors and saturate fat tissue. It takes a minimum of 2 to 4 weeks for CB1 receptors to re-upregulate and for stored THC to fully clear. After cessation. During this withdrawal period, users experience what they often describe as brain fog, irritability, anhedonia, insomnia, and anxiety. These aren't psychological symptoms or missing the habit. They're the neurological consequences of a dopamine system attempting to recalibrate without the external agonist it adapted to. The flattened affect, the difficulty experiencing pleasure, the lack of motivation, these are the inverse image of the receptor downregulation and dopaminergic suppression that occurred during use. Receptor upregulation is slow because the neuron must synthesize new receptors, transport them to the cell membrane, and re-establish functional signaling pathways. The brain doesn't remember its pre-cannabis baseline. It has to reconstruct it through the same neuroplastic mechanisms that produced the downregulation in the first place. This is why withdrawal from cannabis, while not life-threatening like alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal, can be profoundly uncomfortable and protracted. The brain is not detoxing, it's rebuilding. Perhaps the most disorienting aspect of chronic cannabis use is this: the brain at day 30 is not the brain that decided to begin. The dopamine system that evaluates whether activities are worthwhile, whether goals are worth pursuing, whether current behavior patterns should change. That system is itself impaired. This creates a neurological blind spot. The person experiencing reduced motivation and flattened affect often cannot recognize these changes as pathological because the very circuitry required to make that evaluation is compromised. Meanwhile, legalization created market incentives that mirror the tobacco industry's trajectory. Higher potency means faster tolerance, which means more frequent use, which means higher revenue. The green rush economy has a multi-billion-dollar interest in downplaying a motivational syndrome, cognitive impairment, and cannabis use disorder. The gap between public perception and clinical reality grows wider as normalization increases exposure without increasing understanding. We're conducting a population-level experiment with a compound whose long-term high-potency effects have never been studied in brains that have no evolutionary precedent for managing this level of exogenous cannabinoid exposure. 30 days is long enough for your brain to physically restructure its receptor systems, long enough for dopamine synthesis to decline, long enough for your prefrontal cortex's metabolic activity to drop, long enough for RAM debt to accumulate and for THC to saturate your fat tissue. What remains uncertain is how much of this adaptation reverses with cessation, how long recovery takes in different populations, and whether some changes, particularly in adolescent brains, become permanent. The science is clear on what happens during the 30 days. It's less clear on what happens in the 30 years after. If you're still here, thank you for being part of this journey. Subscribe to stay tuned for what's next.